I have spent a good part of my life around numbers, but the older I get, the less impressed I am by numbers that are detached from behavior. A man can show me $1 million dream and still live like a frightened employee. Another man can show me $20,000 in the right place, built the right way, and I can tell his life is already changing. Most people think wealth begins when outsiders start calling you wealthy. I do not think that is how it works. I think wealth begins much earlier. It begins the day your mind stops living one bill ahead of disaster. It begins the day you no longer open your banking app with a knot in your stomach. It begins the day a flat tire, a dental bill, a broken laptop, or a bad week at work no longer feels like a threat to your dignity. For many people, that day arrives long before $1 million. It often arrives around the first 20,000. That number is not magic in the mystical sense. It is not handed down by a committee. It is not a guarantee. It is simply the first amount large enough to change the way an ordinary person thinks, chooses, negotiates, waits, and compounds. That is why I pay attention to it. I have watched people spend years chasing investment brilliance while ignoring the far more important question. Have they actually reached a point where money has stopped controlling their emotions? Until that happens, they are usually not investing. They are reacting. They are not allocating capital. They are dodging fear, and fear is a terrible portfolio manager. People like to imagine wealth as a glamorous finish line. A bigger house, a better car, a cleaner title, a certain number that makes relatives nod and strangers assume competence. But genuine financial progress rarely starts with glamour. It starts with pressure leaving the room. When the pressure leaves, judgment improves. When judgment improves, options widen. When options widen, compounding finally has a chance to matter. That is the sequence most people miss. They want the outer signs of wealth before they have built the inner conditions that make wealth stable. If you have ever pushed a stalled car, you understand the first lesson. The hardest moment is not when the car is already rolling. The hardest moment is the first inch. At the beginning, you strain and question whether the effort is worth it. Nothing looks elegant. Nothing feels impressive. You do not look successful pushing a dead weight uphill. Saving your first meaningful reserve feels like that. You cut expenses nobody sees. You decline purchases nobody applauds. You resist impulses that would give you immediate relief. Month after month, the result can feel absurdly small compared with the effort. That is why so many people abandon the process right before the process becomes powerful. They think the slowness means it is not working. In reality, the slowness is the price of escape velocity. I have seen people live for years in what psychologists would call survival mode. I do not need the academic label to recognize it. You can hear it in their language. They do not ask, "What is the intelligent move?" They ask, "How do I get through this month?" They do not say, "I can wait for the better opportunity." They say, "I have to take whatever is available." They do not consider long-term returns, negotiation leverage, or strategic patience. They think in short breaths. They think in emergencies. They think in avoidance. There is nothing shameful about that. A brain under financial pressure behaves the way any pressured system behaves. It narrows. It prioritizes immediate threat over future gain. That is why the person with no cushion often takes the wrong job, keeps the wrong apartment, accepts the wrong terms, and stays in the wrong environment for too long. It is not because he lacks intelligence, it is because scarcity taxes judgment. When every decision is filtered through fear, the future becomes inaccessible. You cannot calmly plan a better life while your mental house is on fire. That is why the first real reserve matters so much. I have seen research cited that even $2,000 of emergency savings can materially improve financial well-being. I believe it. A small reserve changes the emotional temperature of a household. It does not solve everything, but it interrupts panic. That is not trivial. Panic is expensive. Panic buys at the wrong time. Panic sells at the wrong time. Panic borrows on ugly terms. Panic says yes too quickly and no too late. Then the reserve grows. 2,000 becomes 5, 5 becomes 10. The reserve reaches a level that represents several months of living expenses. For a large number of households, that lands somewhere around $20,000. Now the shift is not merely emotional, it becomes structural. A man with that kind of buffer starts asking a different set of questions. Not, how do I avoid collapse by Friday, but how do I make better use of the next 5 years? That change in questions is one of the great turning points in adult life. I have never met a person who improved his finances without first improving the quality of the questions he asked himself. The poor question is always urgent. The better question is patient. $20,000 does not make you rich. It can, however, make patience possible. That alone changes more lives than clever stock picking ever will. There is also a mathematical truth hiding under the psychological one. At the beginning, your savings effort does almost all the work. If you put away $1,000 a month and earn something like 8% annually on average, getting to the first $20,000 takes time. It takes discipline. It takes repetition. It takes the unglamorous habit of doing something correct before it feels rewarding. Then something interesting happens. The second $20,000 usually arrives faster than the first. Not because you suddenly became a genius, not because the market sent you a personal thank you note. It arrives faster because your prior effort is now assisting your current effort. Capital begins to contribute. At first, then it becomes noticeable. Eventually, it becomes decisive. That is compounding in plain clothes. People often speak about compound interest as if it were a slogan printed on a poster. It is not a slogan. It is a transfer of labor. In the beginning, you are doing nearly all the lifting. Later, your money begins to lift with you. Much later, if you are sensible and persistent, your money does more lifting than you do. That is why the first threshold matters so much. It is the point at which effort stops working alone. Before that threshold, returns can feel insulting. A 10% gain on $2,000 is $200. You notice it, but you do not feel transformed by it. A 10% gain on $20,000 is $2,000. Now the machine is no longer whispering. It is starting to speak. Even at 8%, $20,000 produces $1,600 a year. No one becomes free on $1,600 a year. That is not the point. The point is that, for the first time, some money entered your life that did not require an hour of your labor this week. That experience changes how a person, not intellectually but emotionally, that money can be an employee instead of an emergency. That understanding is one of the most important moments in financial adulthood. Before that, many people still think wealth is built by working harder forever. After that, they begin to see that wealth is built by redirecting surplus into productive assets that work even while they sleep, drive, argue, age, or lose interest. The strategy at that stage is not especially exotic. That is another point people get wrong. They imagine the wealthy must know some secret market doorway hidden behind velvet curtains. There are exclusive opportunities at the extreme high end of wealth, of course, but that is not what explains the importance of the first 20,000. The early transformation is not about access. It is about scale. The person with $1,000 and the person with $20,000 can buy the same broad index fund. They can use the same brokerage. They can read the same books. They can follow the same principles. The only difference is that percentage gains have become consequential enough to change behavior. A small percentage on a tiny base is a pleasant detail. A small percentage on a meaningful base starts to alter your future. That is where psychology and mathematics shake hands. Still, if all you hear in this argument is arithmetic, you are missing the deeper point. The most valuable thing a person gains by saving $20,000 is not the money itself. It is the proof of identity. To save that amount from zero, unless you are unusually fortunate, you had to do several things most adults only talk about. You had to pay attention, you had to delay gratification, you had to decline pleasures that seemed harmless in the moment. You had to repeat a behavior when no one was handing you applause. You had to manage boredom, temptation, comparison, fatigue, and the steady whisper that says, "You deserve a little treat for all this discipline." You had to keep going anyway. That process built a kind of personal evidence. You stop merely hoping you are the sort of person who can control money. You know you are. That is an extraordinary upgrade in self-perception. A person with no evidence of self-control tends to negotiate with himself badly. He treats every impulse as a special case. He says, "This purchase does not really matter." Then he repeats that sentence 100 times a year. Another person has crossed a threshold through repetition and restraint. He has hard evidence that he can subordinate impulse to intention. That evidence spills into the rest of his life. He becomes less noisy in his own mind. He becomes less dramatic about small spending. He becomes more selective about large spending. He becomes harder to manipulate with status. He becomes less available to the marketplace that profits from his impatience. That is a very profitable transformation. One thing that quietly changes after a person builds a reserve is his relationship with inconvenience. Before a cushion exists, inconvenience can feel like catastrophe. The car needs repairs, the rent rises, the refrigerator dies, the child needs something unexpectedly expensive. A plane ticket becomes necessary at the worst possible moment. Without reserves, these are not annoyances. They are destabilizers. They rearrange the month. They force borrowing. They create shame. They invite bad decisions made under the banner of necessity. With $20,000 behind you, many of those same events remain unpleasant. But they lose their power to govern your emotions. That is important. A person who is not emotionally governed by every surprise becomes much harder to trap. Now notice the second-order effect. When ordinary disruptions lose their terror, opportunities become visible. This is one of the least discussed advantages of having a reserve. A person who lives from paycheck to paycheck thinks almost exclusively in terms of threats. That is reasonable. Threats are all around him. But a person who has breathing room begins to notice a different category of event, a conference that could improve his career, a move that increases his earnings potential, a short break between jobs to search carefully instead of desperately, a chance to invest a small amount alongside someone competent, a chance to spend on learning that has a plausible return, an apartment choice made for strategy instead of panic. Not every opportunity is good, of course. Money does not make judgment automatic. It makes judgment possible. That distinction matters. I have heard people say, money goes to money, in a tone that suggests some cosmic unfairness. There is unfairness in life. I will not pretend otherwise. But there is also a more ordinary mechanism at work. People with money possess optionality. Optionality changes behavior. Behavior changes outcomes. Outcomes attract further opportunity. The cycle can be virtuous or vicious. Scarcity makes you hurry. Hurry makes you accept poor terms. Poor terms keep you scarce. A reserve lets you pause. A pause lets you compare. Comparison lets you choose better. Better choices widen the reserve. This is not magic. It is sequence. There is another subtle shift that occurs near this threshold, and I consider it extremely important. A person who has built a serious cushion often stops obsessing over tiny expenses and starts concentrating on the large financial levers that actually shape a life. When people are broke, they often pour endless attention into microscopic choices: the coffee, the brand of cereal, the extra few dollars here and there. Those things are not irrelevant, but most people end up treating nickels like murder weapons while ignoring the far larger dangers quietly draining them every month. Housing, transportation, debt, lifestyle inflation, poor career choices, an inability to save consistently, a habit of financing status. Those are the big levers. When you finally build a reserve, something clarifies. You realize the difference between organic bananas and regular bananas is not what will determine whether you retire with dignity. But choosing a car payment that eats $700 a month for years absolutely might. Choosing housing that stretches you every month absolutely might. Choosing to increase recurring obligations every time income rises absolutely might. The person with no reserve often mistakes constant calculation for financial intelligence. It is usually just financial exhaustion. The person with a reserve can begin to think strategically. That is a better use of the mind. He no longer asks, "Can I survive this purchase?" He asks, "What is the full opportunity cost of this decision?" That question is far more valuable. Opportunity cost is one of the clearest windows into maturity. The immature financial mind asks only whether a payment can be made. The mature financial mind asks what else that capital could have become. A $30,000 car is never just a $30,000 car. It is also the compounding you surrendered. It is the flexibility you reduced. It is the future negotiating power you diluted. It may still be worth buying, but at least now the argument is honest. I have watched many intelligent people postpone freedom because they evaluated expensive choices monthly instead of economically. They asked, "Can I handle $600 a month?" They should have asked, "What am I giving up by locking in $600 a month plus insurance, maintenance, depreciation, and the habit of treating appearance as necessity?" That is a different conversation. The monthly payment question flatters impulse. The opportunity cost question protects the future. Cars are the classic example because they are emotionally potent. They signal arrival, they promise identity, they soothe insecurity, and they lose value with a kind of efficiency that would make any bad business jealous. The average person can spend staggering amounts over a lifetime on transportation while claiming there is no money left to invest. This is not because the arithmetic is difficult. It is because status often feels urgent and compounding rarely does. The beautiful thing about reaching a reserve is that your emotional priorities can begin to reorder themselves. Driving a reliable older car no longer feels like evidence of deprivation. It can feel like evidence of self-respect, not the theatrical self-respect sold by advertising, the quieter kind, the kind that says, I know what I am doing with my capital, and I do not need strangers to approve the packaging. That mindset extends beyond cars, a larger apartment, a more expensive vacation, a hobby that quietly becomes a sinkhole, an education purchase with weak economics, a house chosen for ego rather than margin of safety. The person who has crossed the first meaningful threshold starts seeing these not as isolated desires but as claims against future freedom. That does not mean he becomes a monk. I have no admiration for joyless asceticism performed for social media. Money is meant to support a life, not replace one, but once you genuinely understand what capital can become, waste loses some of its glamour. I consider that progress. Now let me say something that matters enormously and is still underappreciated. The first substantial reserve changes not only your relationship with spending, but your relationship with. This is where many lives quietly diverge. A person living one paycheck from trouble is employed under terms that extend beyond the contract. He is not merely selling labor. He is also surrendering leverage. He cannot easily say no. He cannot easily wait. He cannot easily negotiate. He often cannot even calmly search for something better, because the search itself feels like an unaffordable luxury that makes him vulnerable in ways the employer may never say aloud but almost always senses. Desperation is difficult to hide, and even when others do not exploit it directly, you exploit yourself with it. You stay too long. You underask. You over-tolerate. You shrink your standards to fit your fear. $20,000 can alter that. I sometimes call it walking away money, though the point is not dramatic resignation. The point is posture. A person who could survive for several months without his current paycheck carries himself differently. He listens differently. He answers differently. He bargains differently. He becomes calmer in meetings. He becomes more truthful with unreasonable people. He can pursue better work because he has time to be selective. He can ask for the raise that matches his value, because the worst case no longer feels fatal. Often he does not even need to use the reserve. Its presence changes his behavior enough that outcomes improve before any walking away occurs. Confidence is a curious asset. It tends to attract better responsibilities, better respect, and better economics when it is backed by real independence instead of bluster. And financial independence, even in miniature, is one of the cleanest forms of confidence available to ordinary adults. I have seen people become more articulate, more patient, and more ambitious simply because they were no longer negotiating every sentence against the fear of losing the next paycheck. That is not a minor improvement. It can change a career. A better career, of course, creates more surplus. More surplus expands the reserve. A larger reserve produces greater calm and better choices. Better choices improve earnings and investment behavior. Again, sequence. People are always hunting for hacks when what they need is a reinforcing loop. The first 20,000 helps create one, but the number can also be mishandled, and this is where people sabotage themselves just when the foundation has finally begun to hold. They reach the threshold, they feel the relief, they feel the pride. Then they misread the moment. They think the reserve is a reward to be consumed instead of a base to be defended. That is a costly misunderstanding. The first substantial reserve is not a trophy. It is a hinge. Everything that comes after tends to swing on it. Bend it carelessly and you do not simply lose money, you lose position, you lose momentum, you lose the psychological structure you worked so hard to build. That is why I cringe when people hit a financial milestone and immediately celebrate by expanding obligations. A nicer car because they have been disciplined, a vacation so expensive it undoes the progress, a house payment that converts liquidity into pressure, a lifestyle upgrade justified by the sentence, I earned this. Perhaps they did earn it. That is not the same as saying they should consume it. The great mistake in early wealth building is confusing proof of discipline with permission for drift. The reserve should make your life stronger, not softer. This is why I prefer to think of the first 20,000 as seed capital. That phrase matters. A seed is not admired because of what it looks like today. It is protected because of what it can become, if left undisturbed long enough. Too many people dig up their own seed every time they start feeling slightly prosperous. Then they wonder why the orchard never appears. If you leave that capital intact and continue adding to it, Time begins to perform the trick that discipline alone cannot. Milestones compress. What felt painfully slow at the beginning becomes more cooperative later. Your second meaningful block of capital arrives faster, then the next one faster still. At some point, the money itself starts doing a meaningful share of the work. The person who once needed nearly 2 years of saving to assemble $20,000 may eventually see that same amount appear in months through investment gains and surplus income. That is not fantasy. It is what happens when patience survives long enough to meet scale. People underestimate how emotionally powerful this stage is. The first time capital produces a meaningful amount without extraordinary effort from you, it changes your respect for the process. You stop seeing investing as a hobby for the naturally gifted. You start seeing it as a partner in your independence. I think that is why many investors fail before they truly begin. They never stay with the boring stage long enough to meet the beautiful stage. They want evidence before they are willing to behave in a way that creates evidence. This is backwards. The behavior must come first. Only then does the proof arrive, and the proof usually arrives quietly, not with fireworks, not with applause, not with a viral screenshot. It arrives in the form of reduced panic, improved choices, stronger posture, widening options, and the slow realization that the future no longer feels like something happening to you. It starts feeling like something you can shape. That may be the greatest luxury money offers. Not consumption, not display, not envy from neighbors' agency. The ability to design rather than merely absorb. A reserve is not the full expression of agency, but it is often the first honest taste of it. Now, none of this means $20,000 solves every problem. It does not save a person from foolishness. It does not immunize anyone against greed, vanity, divorce, illness, or terrible judgment. It does not replace insurance, prudence, or earning ability. And the exact number will vary by household. A person with very low expenses may feel this shift earlier. A person in an expensive city may need more than $20,000 before the same psychological change occurs. I am not worshiping a universal number. I am pointing to a practical threshold. A threshold where fear begins to loosen its grip and compounding begins to matter enough to be felt. That is the essence. The essence is not $20,000 for its own sake. The essence is escaping fragility. Fragility is expensive because it contaminates every decision. A fragile person cannot patiently invest. A fragile person cannot wisely negotiate. A fragile person cannot distinguish an inconvenience from a crisis. He overreacts because his margin for error is too thin. He confuses survival spending with deserved spending. He pays extra for speed because he lacks the freedom to wait. He often looks busy, burdened, and financially serious. But beneath that appearance is a simple truth. He has no room. Room is what the first reserve creates. Room to think, room to repair, room to pause, room to refuse, room to compare, room to let a better opportunity come into view. I regard room as one of the most valuable assets in life. It is valuable in calendars, in relationships, in balance sheets, and in character. The people who look most powerful are often merely the people with the most room. More room in time, more room in cash, more room in reputation, more room in decision-making. That room was not created by luck alone. It was usually purchased inch by inch, by saying no long before. This is why I have enormous respect for the person quietly building the first reserve. The world tends to celebrate the visible winner, the buyer, the spender, the person performing prosperity in public. I am often more interested in the invisible builder. The woman driving the ordinary car while her account grows, the man who got a raise and increased his savings rate instead of his rent, the couple who chose flexibility over appearances, the employee who kept his reserve intact and therefore negotiated from calm instead of fear. These people may look less prosperous in the short run. I would not bet against them over a long horizon. There is another important point hidden inside this discussion. Once you have a reserve, small pleasures become easier to enjoy and easier to reject. That sounds contradictory, but it is not. The person with no reserve often feels guilty buying little things and yet keeps buying them because guilt and impulse make a poor partnership. The person with a reserve and a disciplined framework can buy the coffee without fear because it no longer threatens his foundation. He can also skip the coffee without resentment because he does not feel deprived. That is a healthier place to live. Financial maturity is not endless denial. It is proportion. It is knowing which decisions deserve attention and which ones are mostly theater. When your foundation is weak, everything feels dramatic. When your foundation is solid, proportion returns. You stop treating every minor purchase like a constitutional crisis, while ignoring the structural choices wrecking your future. You become harder to distract. That matters more than people think. The modern economy is full of businesses designed to monetize distraction. They profit when you confuse mood management with personal finance. They profit when you finance convenience, identity, comfort, vanity, and urgency, without ever pausing to ask what those habits are displacing. The first reserve helps interrupt that manipulation because it gives you time between stimulus and action. Time is underrated in financial life. The faster you must decide, the more likely you are being taxed by your own fragility. The reserve slows the world down. Slower usually means cheaper. Slower usually means wiser. Slower usually means you can compare one choice against another instead of being bullied by the immediate. That is true in investing as well. People who must have action are usually punished by markets. People who can wait often collect the reward. A person who has learned to build a reserve has already practiced one of investing's most valuable disciplines. Waiting without losing conviction. That is not easy. The marketplace trains you to seek novelty and stimulation. Compounding asks for repetition and restraint. The first 20,000 built honestly is evidence that you can live by the second code instead of the first. That is why I value it so highly. It predicts more than a balance does. It predicts behavior, and behavior over long periods explains a great deal of financial destiny. If I meet two people of equal intelligence, and one has learned to build and defend a meaningful reserve, while the other remains trapped in a cycle of reaction, I know which one I expect to be wealthier 10 years from now. Not because the first person is morally superior, not because he owns secret information, but because he has crossed a threshold that alters decision quality day after day. The market does not need you to be spectacular. It often rewards those who are merely durable. Durability begins with margin of safety. Individuals need it every bit as much as businesses do. I have spent a lifetime insisting on margin of safety in investments. Why would I not want the same thing in a household balance sheet? That is what the first 20,000 really represents. Not luxury, margin of safety. A little room between you and chaos. A little cash between you and desperation. A little patience between you and the wrong decision. A little independence between you and the person trying to dictate terms. Once you see it that way, the number stops feeling arbitrary. It starts feeling foundational. The person who reaches it has not finished the journey. He has simply moved from a cliff edge onto solid ground. From there, better work can be chosen. Better investments can be held. Better terms can be demanded. Better opportunities can be evaluated. None of these outcomes are guaranteed, but all of them become more likely. That is all a rational person can ask for from capital. Not certainty, better odds. I would rather have better odds for 20 years than lucky guesses for 20 minutes. So when someone asks me when wealth truly begins, I do not rush to answer with the flashy number society likes to repeat. I think about the practical threshold where fear stops sitting at the head of the table. I think about the first reserve that changes posture. Not just purchasing power. I think about the amount that lets a person stop living as a financial hostage and start behaving like an owner. For a great many people, that threshold is around $20,000. Reach it honestly, protect it fiercely, add to it steadily. Do not use it to perform success. Use it to create options. Use it to buy time. Use it to improve your standards. Use it to reject bad deals. Use it to think longer. Use it to let compounding finally get a grip on your life. The world will try to convince you that wealth is something loud, a title, a watch, a vehicle, a house big enough to impress people who do not know your balance sheet. I have never found that persuasive. Real progress is usually much quieter than that. It sounds like the absence of panic. It feels like breathing room. It looks like a person who can wait. And if you can truly wait while continuing to save, invest, and think clearly, then the future starts bending in your favor. That is when the game changes. Not when you look rich, when you stop being fragile. That is the day your money begins to work for you instead of against you. That is the day your choices begin to improve instead of merely multiply. That is the day compounding becomes something you can feel in your bones. And that is why the first 20,000 matters so much. Not because it is the finish line, because it is the first stretch of solid ground from which an intelligent life can finally be built.